Grayscale just won their lawsuit against the SEC. Here's everything you need to know. Now, first, let's start with Grayscale. Grayscale launched a Bitcoin trust years ago, almost a decade. And since then, they have become the largest Bitcoin fund in the world. People all around the world that wanted Bitcoin exposure but didn't want to go buy it through the spot market could go on to one of the exchanges and they could buy the Bitcoin trust. But it's a trust. It is not a true ETF. The reason why is because historically, the SEC in the United States has not approved a Bitcoin spot ETF. And so the trust was kind of a workaround. It was a way for you to buy a public ticker and get exposure to Bitcoin without actually having Grayscale go to the SEC and get that approval. Now, in recent years, what we've seen is that that fund became very, very large. Over $40 billion at one point sat inside that Bitcoin trust. Of course, Grayscale wants to convert it to a Bitcoin spot ETF. And so they went ahead and they applied. Converting a trust to an ETF, it's happened before, there's a process, and the SEC's got to approve it. But the SEC denied Grayscale's ability to go ahead and convert from a Bitcoin trust into a Bitcoin spot ETF. Around the same time, the SEC also approved multiple futures-based Bitcoin ETFs. So they weren't spot ETFs, but they were futures-based ETFs. Grayscale obviously was upset by this. They wanted to be the first to get that Bitcoin spot ETF into the US capital markets. And so they decided, in what was somewhat of a controversial move, to sue the SEC. Now, the SEC, not only did they not appreciate that Grayscale was disagreeing with them, they also probably didn't appreciate that Grayscale was suing them as well. But now, this is part of the beauty of America, is that we have both sides, the market participant in Grayscale and the SEC, the regulator, go into court and they lay out their arguments. And in doing so, what it allows for is it allows for the democratic capitalistic process of American courts, the legal system, to work itself out. And so now the SEC has been told, no, Grayscale is correct in this specific situation. This doesn't mean that the SEC is wrong all the time, and it doesn't mean that market participants are right all the time. But what it does mean is that both parties went into court of law and they went ahead and they laid out all of their arguments, and the court decided that they are going to support what Grayscale is arguing. And so what that means is that the SEC now has to vacate the previous denial. They have to go back and they have to reevaluate the application to convert from a Bitcoin trust into a Bitcoin ETF. Now, that does not guarantee that the SEC is going to all of a sudden wave a magic wand and say that Grayscale, it has the Bitcoin spot ETF. Remember, there's many other applications that have been put forward, including kind of the elephant in the room, which is BlackRock. That elephant in the room of BlackRock is now competing with Grayscale. It's somewhat of a foot race to see who can be the first to get a Bitcoin spot ETF approved. Now, why does it matter whether you're the first or not? Well, being the first is actually really, really, really important because what we've seen in the past, take, for example, the futures-based ETFs, the person who got out first or the group that got out first, they're the ones who get most of the assets. And so when you look at Grayscale versus BlackRock, BlackRock has better distribution, BlackRock has a bigger name, and frankly, BlackRock has more trust in the institutional world than Grayscale or any other crypto-related asset manager. And so being able to get out into the market first would be a huge advantage for what some see as the David versus the Goliath. But if all of a sudden the SEC just said, you know what? Green light, everyone gets approved at the same time, then it really is going to come down to where do those assets flow. What we have seen over the years is that when an ETF gets approved and is able to capture assets, if there's an early winner in that category, usually the upstarts are not able to unseat who that winner is. And so getting out first into the market is really, really important, especially with an asset class like Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, where there seems to be a bunch of pent-up demand, people waiting to allocate to the space, but there is no spot ETF. And so literally being the first pays off here. Now, the reason why it's important that the courts made this decision is we're leaving the world of opinions and kind of hot takes on the internet, and we're now getting into the courts. And the courts are able to decide what actually has to happen. They can enforce these rules. And so by saying to the SEC, you have to vacate that denial and go back and reevaluate, the SEC still retains the right to deny the conversion of Grayscale's Bitcoin trust into a spot Bitcoin ETF for any other reason. They have a whole plethora of things that they could bring up and say, we are not going to approve this. But my guess is that that's unlikely to happen, right? We now have a court saying, hey, the reason that you gave initially is not sufficient enough. You also have BlackRock coming in with the application. You have people like ARK Invest, 21 Shares, you have Bitwise, Invesco, the list goes on and on and on. And so my guess is that what's going to happen here is we're getting closer and closer. The odds have increased that a Bitcoin spot ETF is going to get approved in the United States. There's a report on Bloomberg today that says that actually a decision on the application for BlackRock could happen as soon as this week. Given the Grayscale decision, now all of a sudden it kind of puts a light onto this, and we're starting to see people say, okay, are we actually at the end? Are we at the point the Bitcoin spot ETF is going to get approved? I'm not sure, but it does feel like we are much closer today than we were yesterday. On top of that, there's a big question of how many assets would actually flow into a Bitcoin spot ETF. Some people think that it could be a couple $100 million. Some people think it could be tens of billions of dollars. My guess is that within the first 24 to 48 hours, there would be at least $1 billion that would flow into the Bitcoin spot ETF. And then within the first month to 3 months, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw over $10 billion flowing into that asset. Now, why is that important? When you start to think about $1, $5, $10 billion. Some of these asset managers out here have $1 trillion plus. It's not that big. But what it does show you is when you look at the Bitcoin market, the Bitcoin market cap is about $500 billion. And so if you were to go and get $5 billion put into a Bitcoin spot ETF, that's 1% of the total market cap of the asset. And then when you start to look at, okay, well, what happens when it gets to 10 billion, 25 billion, 50 billion, $100 billion? If that's possible, now you start talking about anywhere between 10 to 20% of the total market cap. Now, obviously, Bitcoin's price is volatile. It'll move. And as more money comes in, it'll probably push the price up, given that Bitcoin is a finite asset. But it does begin to speak to the fact that there is going to be a catalyst now. When the Bitcoin spot ETF gets approved, that is a catalyst for the market. And what people have been saying is, look, the market's really illiquid. 70% of the Bitcoin in circulation hasn't moved in over a year. And so if you've got all this illiquidity in the market, you need some sort of catalyst, some sort of increase in demand in order to kickstart what is many people looking at kind of a potential increase in price in the future. And so maybe this Bitcoin spot ETF is that catalyst. If you have a Bitcoin spot ETF that gets approved, then in less than 1 year, you're going to have the Bitcoin halving, which means you're going to have a supply shock. This is a demand shock. This could be a rerun all over again of what we saw in 2020 when we had kind of a supply shock in the halving, and then we had a demand shock with all of the free money that was dropping from the sky getting put into the market. I don't know what's going to happen. No one has a crystal ball. But again, the decision today that Grayscale is going to prevail in this lawsuit against the SEC is definitely moving us one step closer to actually getting a Bitcoin spot ETF in the United States. BlackRock obviously has got to be excited about this as well, because it's putting more pressure on the situation in order to get someone approved so that American investors can now get access to that Bitcoin spot ETF. It's going to be really, really interesting to watch how this plays out through the rest of this week and in the coming months. So please pay attention. If you enjoyed this video, make sure that you go ahead and you subscribe, leave a comment, do all the things that people say to do on YouTube. I appreciate it. I hope this was valuable, and I'll see you guys at the next video.